The notification pierced the pre-dawn silence of Ibrahim Traoré's compound in Ouagadougou like a blade through silk. His secure phone, reserved for communications with other African heads of state, buzzed with an urgency that made his bodyguards instantly alert. But this was not a call from a fellow president or a message from the African Union. This was a screenshot forwarded by his intelligence chief, showing a Twitter post that would reshape the global balance of power. Captain Ibrahim Traoré is now banned from entering the United States. This so-called water hero is actually a dangerous extremist who threatens American interests worldwide. Our intelligence shows he's planning to weaponize African water resources against the free world. We will not be fooled by his fake liberation narrative. #AmericaFirst #WaterSecurity. The tweet bore the blue checkmark of authenticity and the official seal of the President of the United States. Posted at 3:47 a.m. Washington time, it had already been retweeted 50,000 times and sparked a firestorm of global commentary that was reshaping international discourse in real time. Ibrahim set down his phone with the careful precision of a man who had learned to control his reactions under fire. But inside his chest, something ancient and fierce was awakening. The same spirit that had driven his ancestors to resist French colonization, the same fire that had burned in the hearts of liberation fighters across Africa for generations. Fazo ka Lafia, he whispered to himself. The homeland will be peaceful, the traditional more blessing that had sustained his people through decades of foreign interference. Then he reached for his ceremonial phone, the one connected directly to the sacred communication networks that linked African leaders in times of crisis. His first call was to President William Ruto of Kenya, whose own confrontations with Western interference had forged him into one of Africa's most formidable diplomatic warriors. Ndugu, Ruto's voice carried the tension of a man who had been awakened by his own intelligence services with news of the American president's declaration. Brother, they have made their move. The question now is, how do we respond? Through the compound's windows, Ibrahim could see the first light of dawn painting the acacia trees in shades of gold that reminded him of his grandmother's stories. Fatou Traoré had lived through the French colonial period, had watched her own father resist the forced recruitment that fed African bodies into European wars. Her voice echoed in his memory now, carrying warnings about the price of challenging those who believed themselves the masters of the world. President Trump has shown his true face, Ibrahim replied, his voice taking on the rhythmic cadence of oral tradition. He speaks of American interests as if the water beneath African soil belongs to Washington. He calls me dangerous because I refuse to sell our birthright to foreign corporations. But even as he spoke these words, Ibrahim understood that the situation was more complex than simple resource competition. His intelligence networks had been tracking unusual activity around African water sources for months. American military contractors appearing near aquifer sites, European geological surveys being conducted without government permission, Chinese infrastructure projects that seemed more focused on water access than transportation. The second call came before he could place it. President Macky Sall of Senegal, his voice tight with the controlled fury of a leader who had spent decades watching Western powers manipulate African politics through combinations of economic pressure and direct intervention. Mon frère, Sall's words carried the weight of continental solidarity. They have overplayed their hand this time. To publicly brand an African head of state as dangerous for protecting his nation's resources. This is colonial thinking without colonial manners. As the morning progressed, Ibrahim's compound became the nerve center of a continental response that was unprecedented in its coordination and scope. Presidents, prime ministers, and traditional rulers from across Africa participated in secure video conferences that planned a response to what was increasingly being understood as an act of economic warfare disguised as security policy. From his study, surrounded by portraits of African liberation heroes and traditional artifacts that connected him to ancestral wisdom, Ibrahim watched global news coverage of Trump's declaration. CNN, BBC, Fox News, all the major Western networks were running stories that painted him as either a dangerous radical or a naive idealist who had stumbled into geopolitical forces beyond his understanding. But it was Al Jazeera's coverage, with its more nuanced understanding of African politics, that captured the true significance of what was happening. Dr. Amina Cohn, his chief geologist who had become an international symbol of African scientific expertise, was being interviewed via satellite from the still expanding oasis that had once been barren Sahara. What President Trump calls dangerous, Dr. Cohn's voice carried the quiet authority of someone speaking scientific truth to political power, is simply Africa's refusal to remain a beggar at the global table. We have discovered water resources that could feed and sustain hundreds of millions of people. The only thing dangerous about this is what it means for those who profit from African desperation. Behind her, the camera showed a landscape that continued to challenge Western scientific understanding. What had been an empty desert 6 months ago was now a thriving ecosystem of grasslands, young forests, and flowing streams that supported wildlife and vegetation that seemed to emerge from the Earth's deepest memory. But Ibrahim knew that the visual evidence of transformation was only part of the story. The real threat to Western interests lay in what the continental water discoveries represented: the possibility of genuine African independence. Food security, energy independence, and population stability, all the foundations of sovereignty that had been systematically undermined by centuries of foreign control. His secure phone buzzed with an encrypted message from President Cyril Ramaphosa of South Africa. Emergency AU meeting called for tonight. The Americans have forced our hand. Time to implement the Addis Protocols. The Addis Protocols. Ibrahim felt his pulse quicken as he thought about the secret agreements that African leaders had been negotiating for the past decade, contingency plans for exactly this kind of Western aggression. Economic integration measures that could be activated in times of crisis. Mutual defense agreements that went far beyond anything publicly acknowledged. Resource-sharing compacts that could transform Africa from a collection of vulnerable individual nations into a unified continental power. But implementing the protocols would mean crossing a line that could not be uncrossed. It would mean openly challenging the global order that had kept Africa economically subordinate since the end of formal colonialism. It would mean risking the kind of international isolation and economic warfare that had destroyed leaders from Patrice Lumumba to Thomas Sankara. As Ibrahim prepared for what might be the most important video conference in African history, his phone rang with a call from an unexpected source. The caller ID showed only a number, but when he answered, the voice belonged to someone whose very existence was supposed to be classified. Captain Traore. The woman's voice carried a slight American accent but spoke with the authority of someone operating at the highest levels of international intelligence. My name is Dr. Sarah Chin. I'm calling from, let's say, a concerned faction within the U.S. government. We need to talk. The call that followed would reveal the depth of the crisis that Trump's tweet had exposed. Not just a conflict over African water resources, but a battle for the soul of American foreign policy itself. Dr. Chin represented intelligence officials, State Department personnel, and military leaders who understood that branding African leaders as terrorists for protecting their own resources was a strategic catastrophe that could drive the entire continent into the arms of America's competitors. There are those of us who understand that Africa's development serves American interests better than Africa's continued poverty, Dr. Chin explained. But we're fighting against factions that view any African independence as a threat to global stability. President Trump's tweet was not just his opinion. It represents a formal policy decision that could trigger consequences none of us are prepared for. Ibrahim listened with the careful attention of a military strategist assessing intelligence from potentially hostile sources. But there was something in Dr. Chen's voice, an urgency that suggested she was taking enormous personal risks to make this contact, that convinced him she was speaking the truth. What consequences? He asked. Economic sanctions against any nation that supports your water development projects. Military exercises designed to intimidate African governments. Pressure on international organizations to classify resource nationalism as terrorism. And if those measures fail? Dr. Chen's pause carried the weight of possibilities too dangerous to speak directly. There are contingency plans that would make the 2011 Libya intervention look like diplomatic negotiation. The threat hung in the air like smoke from burning villages. Ibrahim understood that he was no longer just a military officer who had stumbled onto a significant geological discovery. He had become the focal point of a global conflict that would determine whether Africa would finally claim its independence or remain forever under the economic control of foreign powers. As he ended the call with Dr. Chin, Ibrahim walked to his window and looked out at the compound where his grandfather had once welcomed French colonial administrators with traditional hospitality while secretly planning resistance operations. The irony was not lost on him. 3 generations later, the same fundamental struggle continued, just with different weapons and more sophisticated methods of control. But this time, Africa had something it had never possessed during the liberation struggles of the 1960s. Resources that the world could not live without, and the technological capability to defend them. The underground ocean was more than water, it was leveraged. The question now was whether African leaders had the courage to use it. The African Union headquarters in Addis Ababa had never hosted a gathering quite like this one. In the secure conference room 3 floors below the main assembly hall, protected by electronic countermeasures that could defeat the most sophisticated surveillance systems, the most powerful leaders in Africa gathered around a table that had been carved from a single piece of Ethiopian olive wood, a symbol of the continent's deep roots and enduring strength. Present were not just the heads of state who typically dominated continental politics, but also figures whose influence operated in shadows, traditional rulers whose authority transcended colonial borders, intelligence chiefs whose networks spanned continents, and economic strategists whose understanding of global finance rivaled anything produced in London or New York. President Felix Tshisekedi of the Democratic Republic of Congo, whose nation sat atop more mineral wealth than any other country on earth, spoke first. His voice carried the gravitas of someone whose people had paid the highest price for foreign resource extraction. Mes frères et sœurs, he began, switching between French and Lingala in the fluid multilingual style that characterized African diplomatic discourse. What President Trump has done is not just an attack on Ibrahim. It is a declaration of war against the concept of African sovereignty itself. The room erupted in a controlled cacophony of agreement, voices speaking in Amharic, Arabic, Swahili, Yoruba, and a dozen other languages that represented the magnificent linguistic diversity of the continent. But beneath the multilingual chorus was a unity of purpose that transcended cultural differences. President Nana Akufo-Addo of Ghana, whose nation had been the first sub-Saharan African country to gain independence, raised his hand in silence. When he spoke, his words carried the weight of historical perspective. In 1957, when we lowered the Union Jack and raised our own flag, Kwame Nkrumah warned us that political independence without economic independence was meaningless. Today, nearly 70 years later, we face the test of whether we truly learned that lesson. On the wall-mounted screens around the room, real-time satellite imagery showed the continuing transformation of the Sahel. The green zones that had begun around Ibrahim's drilling sites were now spreading across international borders, following underground water channels that seemed to respond to some deeper geological awakening. Mali, Niger, Chad, Sudan, all reported similar phenomena as ancient aquifers began releasing waters that carried with them the genetic memory of ecosystems that predated human civilization. Dr. Akinwumi Adesina, president of the African Development Bank, presented economic projections that made even seasoned leaders pause in amazement. Conservative estimates suggest that full development of the continental water resources could increase Africa's agricultural output by 2,000% within a decade. We could not only feed ourselves but become the world's largest food exporter. The economic implications are transformative. But it was Ibrahim himself, participating via secure video link from Ouagadougou, who provided the strategic framework that would guide their response to American aggression. Brothers and sisters, his voice carried the authority of a man who had looked into the face of ancestral power and found his destiny there. They call me dangerous because they understand what we are on the verge of achieving. For the first time since the Berlin Conference divided our continent among European powers, we have the resources and the unity to claim true independence. The reference to Berlin was not casual. Every leader in that room understood the historical parallel. In 1884, European powers had gathered in Berlin to carve up Africa without a single African voice being heard. Now, 141 years later, African leaders were gathering to determine how to respond to Western attempts to maintain that same system of control through different means. President Paul Kagame of Rwanda, whose nation had transformed itself from genocide to prosperity through disciplined resistance to foreign interference, leaned forward with the intensity that had made him one of Africa's most feared negotiators. The Americans have made a strategic error, he said, his English carrying the precision of someone who had mastered multiple languages as tools of statecraft. By publicly branding Ibrahim as dangerous, they have forced us to choose sides. They assumed we would abandon him to protect our individual relationships with Washington. Instead, they have pushed us toward unity. Around the table, heads nodded in agreement. Trump's tweet had accomplished what decades of African Union meetings had struggled to achieve. It had made continental solidarity not just an idealistic goal but a practical necessity for survival. But it was President Alpha Condé of Guinea, one of the continent's elder statesmen, who voiced the question that haunted them all. Unity is beautiful to speak of, but what does it mean in practice when they have the power to destroy our economies with sanctions, to freeze our assets in international banks, to turn our own militaries against us through the officers they trained in their academies? The question hung in the air like incense in an ancient cathedral, heavy with the weight of historical experience. Everyone present had seen what happened to African leaders who challenged Western interests too directly. Gaddafi's Libya, Sankara's Burkina Faso, Lumumba's Congo. The graveyards of African independence were filled with leaders who had dared to put their people's interests before foreign profits. But this time was different, and it was President Uhuru Kenyatta of Kenya who articulated why. They are not dealing with individual nations that can be isolated and destroyed one by one. The water discoveries extend across the entire continental aquifer system. To stop us, they would have to sanction and invade half of Africa simultaneously. Even American imperial power has limits. The strategic reality was becoming clear. The underground ocean that Ibrahim had discovered was not confined to Burkina Faso's borders. Geological surveys were revealing connected aquifer systems that extended from Senegal to Somalia, from Algeria to Angola. Any attempt to prevent African development of these resources would require intervention on a scale that would dwarf every previous military adventure in African history. Dr. Ngozi Okonjo-Iweala, former Director General of the World Trade Organization and one of Africa's most respected economists, had been quietly reviewing financial data throughout the meeting. When she finally spoke, her words carried the authority of someone who understood global economic systems better than perhaps any other African alive. The leverage equation has shifted, she announced, her Nigerian accent lending musical quality to words that carried revolutionary implications. For centuries they held the leverage because we needed their markets, their technology, their capital more than they needed our resources. But water changes everything. Climate change, population growth, industrial expansion. The world is entering a period of absolute water scarcity. We are no longer selling luxury goods to wealthy consumers. We are controlling access to the fundamental requirement for human survival. The room fell silent as the implications sank in. They were not just discussing resistance to American pressure. They were contemplating the possibility of reversing the entire relationship between Africa and the developed world. President Macron of France had already begun mobilizing European response to what his advisors were calling the African water crisis. Intelligence reports suggested that NATO was conducting emergency planning sessions focused on scenarios where European access to global resources might be threatened by African unity. China, meanwhile, was quietly increasing its diplomatic engagement with every African nation, offering alternative partnerships that could replace Western economic relationships. But it was a message from an unexpected source that crystallized the moment's historical significance. Elder Wangari Maatai's daughter, carrying forward her mother's legacy of environmental activism and African feminism, had sent a video message from Nairobi that was played on the room's main screen. Mama Africa, she began, using the title that had come to represent the continent's maternal wisdom, today you face the same choice our ancestors faced when the ships first appeared on our shores. You can submit to those who claim the right to rule over you, or you can remember who you are. Behind her, the camera showed the growing oasis that had once been the heart of the Sahara. Children played beside streams that had not existed a year ago. Farmers planted crops in soil that was becoming fertile through processes that Western science still struggled to understand. Wildlife was returning, antelopes, lions, elephants, as if the earth itself was calling back its children. The ancestors are watching, she continued, her voice taking on the cadence of traditional praise poetry. They see leaders who have the chance to complete the work of liberation that began with independence. The water spirits have given you the tools. The only question is whether you have the courage to use them. The video ended in silence that stretched like the moment before lightning strikes. Finally, President Cyril Ramaphosa of South Africa, whose nation controlled the continent's most sophisticated financial and military infrastructure, stood and walked to the ancient map of Africa that dominated one wall of the conference room. Madibas and Mamas, he said, invoking both male and female ancestral wisdom, I call for a formal vote on activating the Addis Protocols. Full economic integration, mutual military assistance, and coordinated resistance to all forms of foreign economic coercion. The vote that followed was unanimous, but it was conducted in a manner that honored both contemporary diplomatic procedures and ancient decision-making traditions. Each leader spoke their agreement not just in their official capacity, but as representatives of ancestral wisdom that extended back thousands of years. When Ibrahim's turn came, he spoke not from Ouagadougou but from the edge of the expanding oasis, where the sound of flowing water provided a background rhythm to his words. In the name of my grandmother Fatou, who carried water on her head through the drought years, I vote yes. In the name of Thomas Sankara, who died defending Burkina Faso's right to determine its own destiny, I vote yes. In the name of all the children who will drink from these waters in generations to come, I vote yes. As the sun set over Addis Ababa, The leaders of Africa had committed themselves to a path that would either lead to genuine independence or to a confrontation with Western power that would reshape the global order. The die was cast, the ancestors had been invoked, and the water spirits had been called upon to witness oaths that could not be broken. President Trump's tweet, intended to isolate and intimidate a single African leader, had instead unified a continent and set in motion forces that would challenge 5 centuries of Western dominance over African affairs. The revolution had begun not with guns or declarations, but with water rising from the depths of the earth, carrying with it the dreams of liberation that had never truly died. 3 days after the Addis Ababa summit, the war between Africa and Western interests took an unexpected turn. It began not with military action or economic sanctions, but with a meeting in a glass tower overlooking San Francisco Bay, where the most powerful technology executives in the world gathered to discuss what they euphemistically called the African situation. In the 42nd floor conference room of Meridian Technologies, the view stretched from the Golden Gate Bridge to the Oakland Hills, a panorama of American innovation and prosperity that seemed to mock the idea that a collection of African nations could challenge Silicon Valley's global dominance. But the men and women seated around the carbon fiber conference table were not laughing. Marcus Wellington, CEO of Meridian Technologies and architect of the surveillance systems that monitored half the world's internet traffic, opened the meeting with characteristic directness. "Gentlemen, ladies, we have a problem. The African water situation is no longer just about resources, it's about information control." On the room's wall-size screen, real-time data streams showed social media activity across the African continent. Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, TikTok, all the platforms that had become the nervous system of global communication were lighting up with content that challenged Western narratives about African capability and Western benevolence. Dr. Jennifer Liu, head of algorithmic manipulation at Cosmos Media, highlighted the scope of the challenge with clinical precision. African social media engagement has increased by 340% since President Trump's tweet. But more concerning is the content quality. These aren't the usual emotional responses we can easily discredit. They're posting scientific data, economic analyses, historical documentation, content that's reshaping global perceptions of African competence. The irony was not lost on anyone in the room. For decades, Silicon Valley had celebrated itself as a force for democratization, breaking down barriers and giving voice to the voiceless. But when those voices began challenging American economic hegemony, democracy suddenly seemed like a dangerous luxury. Sarah Chin, the same Dr. Chin who had secretly contacted Ibrahim, sat at the far end of the table, her presence representing the intelligence community's interest in what was being called information warfare mitigation. Her expression was carefully neutral, but inside she was documenting everything for a very different purpose than her colleagues imagined. "The traditional approaches won't work here," warned David Kim, whose artificial intelligence systems controlled the recommendation algorithms that determined what billions of people saw on their social media feeds. "We can't simply suppress African content without triggering exactly the kind of international backlash that would validate their claims about Western information manipulation." But it was Elena Vasquez, the former CIA operative who now directed strategic communications for the tech consortium, who proposed the solution that would define the next phase of the conflict. "We don't suppress their content," she said, her voice carrying the cold calculation of someone who had orchestrated regime changes on 3 continents. "We drown it. Flood every platform with content that associates African water discoveries with instability, conflict, environmental damage. Make people afraid of African success instead of inspired by it." The strategy that emerged from that meeting would have impressed Machiavelli with its sophistication. Instead of direct censorship, they would deploy an army of artificial intelligence systems designed to shape global perception through what they called narrative architecture. Fake scientific studies questioning the environmental impact of rapid ecosystem restoration. Economic analyses warning that African water independence would trigger global food shortages. Social media campaigns suggesting that African unity was a threat to world peace. All of it crafted with the subtle skill of professionals who had spent decades manipulating public opinion. But Sarah Chin had been recording everything, and within hours of the meeting's conclusion, encrypted files were making their way through channels that Silicon Valley executives would never have imagined existed, networks of African technology professionals, diaspora intellectuals, and sympathetic Western intelligence officers who understood that American interests were better served by African prosperity than by African subjugation. The files reached Ibrahim through Dr. Cohn, whose scientific contacts at international universities had become an informal intelligence network that could rival anything possessed by traditional spy agencies. As he reviewed the Silicon Valley conspiracy from his office in Ouagadougou, Ibrahim felt the familiar presence of his grandmother's wisdom rising in his consciousness. "They think they can control the story the way they controlled the history books," he murmured to himself, remembering how colonial education had taught African children to see themselves through European eyes. "But this time we write our own narrative." The African response was swift and devastating in its effectiveness. Instead of trying to counter Silicon Valley's propaganda directly, African governments activated resource networks that few Western observers even knew existed. The African diaspora in technology, engineers at Google, Facebook, Apple, and Amazon who had maintained quiet but deep connections to their homelands, began what they called Operation Ubuntu, named after the Southern African philosophy that emphasized interconnectedness and mutual support. Dr. Kwame Asante, a senior machine learning engineer at Facebook who had grown up in Accra before earning his PhD at MIT, typified the participants in this underground resistance. By day he optimized algorithms for Facebook's advertising systems. By night, he developed counter-algorithms designed to amplify authentic African voices and expose artificial manipulation attempts. "They taught us their technology," Dr. Asante explained in an encrypted video conference with Ibrahim and other African leaders. "They thought we would be grateful servants forever. They never imagined we might use their own tools to liberate our people." The battle that followed was invisible to most of the world, but it raged across every platform and through every algorithm that shaped global information flow. Western artificial intelligence systems would suppress African content, only to find it reappearing through networks they couldn't trace. Fake academic studies would be published, only to be immediately debunked by African scientists whose credentials were impeccable. Most devastating to the Western information war was the simple power of visual truth. Satellite imagery of the expanding oasis could not be faked or manipulated. Videos of children playing beside streams in what had been barren desert could not be dismissed as propaganda. The Earth itself was providing evidence that challenged Western narratives about African incompetence. But the technology war was only one front in a broader conflict that was reshaping global power relationships in ways that no one had anticipated. In Beijing, Chinese leadership was watching the African-American confrontation with the careful attention of strategists who understood that they might be witnessing the emergence of a new global order. President Xi Jinping's private meeting with his African affairs advisors, monitored by Western intelligence but misunderstood in its implications, focused not on how China could exploit African-American tensions, but on how China could position itself as a partner rather than a patron in an Africa that was rapidly becoming the world's most important geopolitical player. "The Americans make the same mistake as the Europeans," observed Wang Li, China's most experienced Africa analyst. "They see African development as a threat to their dominance. We see it as an opportunity for mutually beneficial partnership with what may soon be the world's largest unified economic zone." Chinese infrastructure investment in Africa, previously viewed by Western observers as debt-trap diplomacy designed to create Chinese colonies, was quietly being restructured into genuine partnership agreements that offered African nations technological sovereignty along with economic development. Meanwhile, in Moscow, President Putin was conducting his own strategic calculations. Russian military advisors had been quietly positioned in several African nations for years, originally as part of traditional arms sales relationships. But now they were reporting something that surprised even the most experienced Kremlin Africa hands. African governments were displaying levels of strategic coordination and technological sophistication that rivaled anything they had seen from established powers. "They are not seeking domination," reported Colonel Dmitry Volkov, whose 20 years of African experience had made him one of Russia's most trusted advisors on continental affairs. "They are seeking respect. The difference is profound in its implications." But it was in European capitals that the full magnitude of the crisis was beginning to be understood. The European Union's emergency session on the African water crisis revealed the depth of European dependence on African resources and markets that had been carefully hidden from public view. President Macron of France, whose nation had maintained economic control over its former African colonies through the CFA franc system and bilateral agreements, found himself facing the possibility that French prosperity might be fundamentally dependent on African poverty, a relationship that was becoming increasingly difficult to maintain. "We are approaching a moment of reckoning," Macron told his advisors in a private meeting that would never appear in official records. "Either we learn to relate to Africa as equals, or we risk losing the continent entirely to powers that are willing to offer genuine partnership. The irony was profound. Western powers had spent centuries developing systems designed to extract maximum value from Africa while providing minimum compensation. Now, faced with the possibility of genuine African independence, they were discovering that their own prosperity might be more dependent on African resources than they had ever admitted. As the sun set over the expanding oasis that had once been empty Sahara, Ibrahim stood beside the original drilling site where old Musa continued his daily meditation. The elderly diviner's presence had become a symbol of the spiritual dimension of their struggle. The understanding that they were fighting not just for resources or political power, but for the right to determine their own relationship with the earth that had sustained their ancestors for millennia. The water spirits are patient, Musa said, his weathered hands resting on soil that grew more fertile with each passing day. They waited through the centuries of conquest, through the decades of independence that was not true independence. Now they give us the tools we need. The question is whether we have the wisdom to use them well. Ibrahim nodded, understanding that the old man was speaking about more than water management or economic policy. They were engaged in a struggle that would determine whether Africa would finally claim its place as an equal among the world's great powers, or whether it would remain forever subordinate to outside forces that claimed the right to determine African destiny. The stakes could not be higher, and the outcome would reshape not just Africa, but the entire global order that had emerged from centuries of Western dominance. The revolution that had begun with water rising from the desert was about to test whether the meek truly could inherit the earth. The invitation arrived through channels so secure that even Ibrahim's intelligence chief couldn't trace its origin. A single line in more, written in the elegant script that suggested traditional education, Tuma iya dunya, come and see the world. Below it, coordinates for a meeting that would change everything. 3 weeks after Silicon Valley's information war had been exposed and countered, Ibrahim found himself in the most unlikely of places, a private dacha outside Moscow, seated across from President Vladimir Putin in a room where the walls were lined with icons and the air carried the scent of burning birch wood. Captain Traore, Putin's English carried the slight accent that had become familiar to global audiences, but there was something different in his tone, a respect that Ibrahim had rarely heard from Western leaders. I hope you will forgive the unusual circumstances, but what I have to show you requires absolute privacy. The Russian president gestured to a wall-mounted screen that flickered to life with satellite imagery that made Ibrahim's breath catch in his throat. The images showed not just the African oasis he knew was expanding, but similar phenomena across Central Asia, Siberia, Eastern Europe, underground water systems that seemed to be responding to the same mysterious awakening that had transformed the Sahara. What you discovered in Burkina Faso, Putin continued, his voice taking on the tone of someone sharing state secrets, was not an isolated phenomenon. Our geological surveys have been detecting similar aquifer activations across the Eurasian landmass. Whatever is happening, it is global in scope. Dr. Yelena Volkov, Russia's leading hydrogeologist, entered the room carrying files that bore classification stamps Ibrahim couldn't read but recognized as indicating the highest levels of security. Her presentation revealed discoveries that challenged everything the world thought it knew about underground water systems. The data suggests that global aquifer systems are interconnected in ways we never understood, Dr. Volkov explained, her English fluent despite her obvious nervousness at sharing such sensitive information. When the African systems began activating, we detected sympathetic responses in aquifers thousands of kilometers away. It is as if the Earth's water table operates as a single, integrated system. Putin leaned forward, his expression serious in a way that reminded Ibrahim that, whatever his other characteristics, the Russian president was a strategist who understood global power dynamics with frightening clarity. President Trump calls you dangerous because you threaten American control of global resources, Putin said. But I believe you represent something far more significant. Evidence that the Earth itself may be responding to human activity in ways that could reshape every assumption about environmental limits and resource scarcity. The conversation that followed revealed the depth of Russian concern about Western attempts to maintain unipolar dominance through resource control. Unlike the Americans and Europeans who seemed to view African water independence as a threat to be suppressed, the Russians saw it as an opportunity to break the Western monopoly on global resource flows. We propose a different kind of partnership, Putin explained, his words careful but loaded with implications. Not the extractive relationships that have characterized Western engagement with Africa, but genuine strategic cooperation between sovereign equals. The offer was breathtaking in its scope. Russian nuclear technology for African energy independence. military cooperation agreements that would protect African nations against Western intervention. Most importantly, integration into alternative economic systems that could provide African nations with markets and financial services independent of Western-controlled institutions. But it was Putin's final revelation that truly staggered Ibrahim. From a secured file, the Russian president produced documents that appeared to be classified American intelligence assessments of what they called the African water threat. "Your intelligence services should be aware," Putin said, his voice carrying the cold authority of someone delivering a warning, "that Washington has activated contingency plans for military intervention if African water development proceeds beyond what they consider acceptable limits." The documents detailed American military preparations that were chilling in their scope. Rapid deployment forces positioned in bases across North and West Africa. Naval assets being repositioned in the Atlantic and Mediterranean. Most ominously, what appeared to be targeting assessments for infrastructure that could be destroyed to prevent African water distribution systems from becoming operational. Ibrahim studied the documents with the attention of someone whose military experience had taught him to recognize genuine intelligence versus disinformation. The details were too specific, too consistent with American operational patterns, to be fabricated. The United States was preparing for war. "Why are you showing me this?" Ibrahim asked, understanding that Putin's motivations were certainly more complex than simple concern for African welfare. Putin's smile was thin but not without genuine warmth. "Because a multipolar world serves Russian interests better than continued American hegemony. Your success challenges the same systems that have constrained Russian sovereignty for decades. We have a common cause." The meeting that followed involved strategic discussions that would have terrified Western intelligence agencies if they had been able to monitor them. Russian satellite intelligence about American military movements. Chinese economic data about resource flows that could be redirected away from Western markets. Technological cooperation agreements that could accelerate African development while providing Russia and China with new markets and strategic partnerships. But it was the spiritual dimension of the conversation that surprised Ibrahim most. Putin, despite his reputation as a ruthless pragmatist, seemed genuinely interested in the traditional African understanding of the relationship between people and the earth. "Your elder Musa," Putin said, referencing intelligence briefings that suggested Russian monitoring of African communications was more sophisticated than anyone had imagined. "He speaks of water spirits and ancestral wisdom. In Russia we have similar traditions, the understanding that the land has its own consciousness, its own will." The comment revealed something about Putin that Western analysts had missed. His deep connection to Russian Orthodox mysticism and Slavic paganism that viewed the earth as a living entity worthy of respect rather than simply a resource to be exploited. As the day progressed, Ibrahim found himself engaged in conversations that ranged from military strategy to environmental philosophy, from economic theory to spiritual practice. It was unlike any diplomatic meeting he had ever experienced. A genuine attempt to understand not just political positions but the deeper worldviews that shaped them. The culmination came when Putin led Ibrahim to a private chapel within the dacha, where Orthodox icons shared wall space with artifacts that seemed to reflect Russia's pre-Christian spiritual traditions. Before an icon of Saint Sergius of Radinez, patron saint of Russia, Putin lit candles and spoke words that revealed the depth of his understanding of what they were really fighting for. "In Russian Orthodox tradition," Putin said, his voice taking on the cadence of prayer, "we believe that the earth is God's creation, not man's possession. What the Americans call resource management, we call stewardship. What they call national security, we call spiritual responsibility." Ibrahim felt the presence of his own ancestors in that sacred space, understanding that despite vast cultural differences, he and Putin were united by something deeper than political calculation. A shared belief that the earth itself had consciousness and will that transcended human attempts at control. "The water spirits that your elder speaks of," Putin continued, "perhaps they are the same forces that our ancestors called Rusalka, the spirits that guard the sacred waters. Different names, but the same understanding that water belongs to itself, not to those who claim to own the land above it." The conversation that followed was unlike anything in Ibrahim's diplomatic experience. Two leaders from vastly different cultures, finding common ground in spiritual traditions that both of their nations' colonial experiences had nearly destroyed. Russian Orthodox mysticism and African traditional religion, meeting in recognition that their struggle was ultimately about more than resources or political power. But it was Putin's final gift that truly revealed the depth of Russian commitment to challenging Western hegemony. From a secured vault, He produced documents that would have triggered international crises if their contents had been known to Western intelligence agencies. "These are the complete files of Operation Desert Shield," Putin said, his voice carrying the weight of revelations that could reshape global politics. Not the 1991 Gulf War operation, but a current American contingency plan for military intervention in the Sahel if African water development threatens what they consider strategic resource flows. The documents were devastating in their implications. Detailed invasion plans that would make the 2003 Iraq invasion look like a limited police action. Strategic bombing targets that included not just military installations but civilian infrastructure, hospitals, schools, water treatment facilities. Most chilling of all, population management protocols that seemed designed to create refugee crises that would justify international intervention. They call it humanitarian intervention. Putin's voice carried the bitter experience of American humanitarian missions that had destroyed nations from Yugoslavia to Libya. But the real goal is to prevent Africa from achieving the kind of technological and economic independence that could challenge Western control of global resource flows. Ibrahim studied the documents with growing horror and determination. The United States was not just planning economic pressure or diplomatic isolation. They were preparing for total war against African independence, disguised as humanitarian intervention and counterterrorism operations. "President Putin," Ibrahim said, his voice taking on the authority of a leader who had found his moment of destiny, "what you are offering is not just partnership, it is survival. Without alternatives to Western economic systems, we will be forced to choose between submission and destruction." Putin nodded with the satisfaction of a strategist whose careful planning was finally paying dividends. "The choice is not just yours, Captain. Russia and China face the same fundamental challenge: how to exist as sovereign powers in a world where the Americans claim the right to determine everyone else's destiny." The agreement that emerged from that meeting would remain secret for months, but its implications would reshape global politics in ways that would take years to fully understand. Russian military technology transfers that would give African nations defensive capabilities rivaling those of European powers. Economic integration agreements that could redirect global trade flows away from Western-controlled shipping routes and financial systems. Most importantly, intelligence sharing arrangements that would give African leaders advance warning of Western intervention plans. But as Ibrahim prepared to leave the Moscow dacha, Putin offered one final piece of intelligence that would prove crucial in the weeks to come. "Your friend Dr. Sarah Chin," Putin said, his words carrying the weight of knowledge that suggested Russian intelligence penetration of American systems was deeper than anyone imagined. "She is not just a concerned intelligence officer. She represents a faction within the American establishment that understands America's long-term interests are better served by partnership with a prosperous Africa than by perpetual conflict with an impoverished one." The revelation added another layer of complexity to Ibrahim's understanding of the forces arrayed around the African water crisis. It was not simply a conflict between Africa and the West, but a broader struggle within Western power structures between those who profited from African poverty and those who understood that African prosperity could benefit everyone. As Ibrahim's aircraft lifted off from the Moscow airport, carrying him back to a continent that was rapidly becoming the center of global attention, he reflected on the irony of his situation. A year ago, he had been a relatively unknown military officer leading a routine geological survey. Now he was at the center of a conflict that could determine whether the 21st century would be characterized by continued Western dominance or by the emergence of a truly multipolar world. But it was the memory of old Mouse's words that provided him with the spiritual framework to understand his role in these vast historical forces. Jido Karoba Ti Soro Ka Kalanyi, the water spirits are not found alone. The struggles of different peoples for dignity and sovereignty were connected in ways that transcended geography and culture. The revolution that had begun with water rising from the Sahara was revealing itself to be part of a global awakening that could reshape human civilization itself. The question was whether those who had profited from the old order would allow such transformation to proceed peacefully, or whether they would choose war rather than accept a world where they could no longer claim the right to determine everyone else's destiny. The emergency meeting of the United Nations Security Council had been called by the United States, but as the delegates gathered in New York, it was clear that the balance of global power was shifting in ways that traditional diplomatic forums were struggling to accommodate. The agenda item was listed simply as threats to regional stability in sub-Saharan Africa, but everyone present understood they were really debating whether the international system could accommodate African independence. Secretary of State Antony Blinken led the American delegation with the grim determination of a man who understood that his nation's global hegemony was facing its most serious challenge since the end of the Cold War. Across the table, Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi observed the proceedings with the patient attention of someone who had spent decades waiting for exactly this moment. The rapid and uncontrolled development of water resources in the Sahel region, Blinken began, his words carrying the diplomatic polish that made American threats sound like concerned observations, poses significant risks to regional stability and global environmental security. But it was the Chinese response that revealed how fundamentally the geopolitical landscape had shifted. Instead of the usual careful neutrality that had characterized Chinese positions on African affairs, Wang Yi's statement was a direct challenge to American authority. The People's Republic of China, Wang Yi announced, his English carrying the precision of someone delivering a prepared declaration of policy, formally recognizes the sovereign right of African nations to develop their natural resources in accordance with their own national interests and traditional practices. The silence that followed was pregnant with the implications of what had just occurred. China had not just supported African water development, they had directly challenged the American claim to determine what constituted legitimate resource management for other nations. But the real bombshell came when Ibrahim himself appeared via video link from the expanding oasis that had become the symbol of African transformation. His presence in the Security Council chamber, even virtually, represented something unprecedented. An African leader addressing the global community not as a supplicant seeking aid or permission, but as an equal asserting rights. "Honorable delegates," Ibrahim began, his voice carrying the rhythmic cadence that had become his trademark in international forums, "I speak to you from land that 1 year ago was a barren desert. Today it supports forests, farms and flowing rivers that provide life to millions of people." Behind him, the camera showed a landscape that continued to challenge Western scientific understanding. What had been empty sand dunes were now rolling grasslands dotted with acacia trees. Streams flowed where no water had existed in recorded history. Children played beside pools that reflected skies that had been darkened by Saharan dust storms for centuries. "The United States claims that our development of these water resources threatens regional stability," Ibrahim continued, his words measured but carrying unmistakable steel. "I would ask the Security Council to consider what truly threatens stability: African children having access to clean water, or American corporations losing control of African markets?" The accusation was delivered with diplomatic courtesy, but its impact was devastating. Ibrahim had publicly stated what everyone in that room understood, but no one had been willing to say: that American concerns about African water development were not about environmental protection or regional stability, but about economic control. French Representative Catherine Colonna attempted to provide European support for the American position, but her words carried none of the conviction that had once characterized Western interventions in African affairs. "France shares American concerns about the pace of environmental change in the Sahel," she said, her voice revealing the weakness of a position that no longer carried moral authority. "Rapid ecosystem transformation without proper international oversight could have unpredictable consequences." But it was the response from African delegates that revealed how much had changed since the colonial era. Instead of the individual nation-by-nation responses that had characterized previous African participation in international forums, the entire African Union delegation spoke with a unified voice that commanded respect. President Macky Sall of Senegal, speaking as the current chair of the African Union, delivered a statement that would be remembered as one of the defining moments of 21st-century diplomacy. "For 500 years," Sall began, his French-accented English carrying the weight of continental history, "Africa has been told by others what constitutes proper development of our resources. We have been lectured about environmental responsibility by nations whose industrial development poisoned their own air and water. We have been warned about regional stability by powers whose interventions have destabilized our continent for generations." The speech that followed was a masterpiece of diplomatic rhetoric that systematically dismantled every justification that had been used for foreign control of African affairs. Environmental protection arguments were countered with data showing that African water development was actually reversing desertification and improving global climate patterns. Security concerns were addressed by pointing out that American military interventions had created far more instability than African resource development ever could. But it was Sall's conclusion that truly captured the historical significance of the moment. "The age of explaining our sovereignty to others is ending. Africa will develop its resources in accordance with African interests, guided by African wisdom, for the benefit of African people." The applause that followed broke with Security Council protocol, but it reflected a global recognition that something fundamental had shifted in international relations. The Chinese delegation applauded openly. The Russian representative smiled with obvious satisfaction. Even some European delegates seemed relieved that someone had finally stated clearly what everyone knew, that the old system of Western paternalism over African affairs was no longer sustainable. But it was what happened after the formal session that truly revealed the depth of the changes taking place. In a private meeting room normally reserved for superpower negotiations, Ibrahim found himself in conversation with Wang Yi and several Chinese officials whose presence suggested that Beijing was treating the African water crisis as a strategic opportunity of the highest importance. Captain Traore, Wang Yi began, his manner conveying the respect that China had learned to show to leaders of resource-rich nations. China has followed with great interest the remarkable developments in your region. We believe these changes represent opportunities for mutually beneficial cooperation. The proposal that followed was staggering in its scope and implications. Chinese infrastructure investment that would dwarf the Marshall Plan. Technology transfers that would give African nations manufacturing capabilities rivaling those of developed countries. Most importantly, integration into Chinese-led financial systems that could provide alternatives to Western-controlled international banking. The Belt and Road Initiative, explained Dr. Zhang Wei, China's leading expert on African development, was always intended to create alternative pathways for global trade and development. Your water discoveries accelerate the timeline for African participation from decades to years. The conversation revealed the depth of Chinese strategic thinking about the implications of African water independence. Unlike the Americans who saw African development as a threat to be suppressed, the Chinese understood it as an opportunity to create new centers of economic activity that could challenge Western dominance of global trade flows. A prosperous Africa, Wang Yi explained, serves Chinese interests in ways that an impoverished Africa never could. We seek markets, not colonies. We offer partnership, not paternalism. But it was the military dimension of Chinese proposals that truly revealed how seriously Beijing was taking the American threat to African water development. Intelligence sharing agreements that would give African nations advance warning of Western intervention plans. Defensive weapons systems that could protect critical infrastructure against airstrikes. Most significantly, mutual defense agreements that would make American military intervention in Africa a direct challenge to China's security interests. The implications were staggering. China was essentially offering to extend its nuclear umbrella over African water development projects, making American military intervention a potential trigger for global conflict. But even as Ibrahim recognized the transformative potential of Chinese partnership, he was also aware of the spiritual and cultural dimensions of the choices facing Africa. The water spirits that had awakened the underground ocean had not done so to replace Western domination with Chinese hegemony. They had done so to restore African agency in determining African destiny. It was this understanding that shaped Ibrahim's response to Chinese offers. Minister Wang, he said, his voice carrying the authority of someone who spoke not just for Burkina Faso but for ancestral wisdom that transcended national boundaries, China offers partnership where the West offers domination. This is progress. But true partnership requires recognition that Africa brings its own wisdom, its own capabilities, its own understanding of the relationship between people and the earth. Wang Yi's nod suggested that Chinese leadership understood the distinction Ibrahim was making. Unlike previous resource partnerships where China had provided technology and investment in exchange for raw materials, the African water crisis was creating opportunities for genuine technological and intellectual exchange between equals. African innovations in water management and ecosystem restoration, Wang Yi acknowledged, could benefit Chinese agricultural development and environmental protection efforts. We seek to learn as well as to teach. The meeting that followed involved detailed discussions of technological cooperation that would have been unimaginable just months before. African traditional knowledge about sustainable water use combined with Chinese engineering expertise. Chinese manufacturing capabilities paired with African mineral resources and agricultural potential. Most intriguing joint research projects that would investigate the spiritual and scientific dimensions of the Earth's apparent awakening to human environmental distress. But it was Wang Yi's final revelation that truly captured the global significance of what was happening. President Xi has asked me to convey a personal message, the Chinese foreign minister said, his words carrying the weight of communications from the highest levels of Chinese leadership. The awakening you have witnessed in Africa appears to be part of global patterns that we are detecting across Asia as well. The Earth itself may be responding to human environmental damage in ways that could reshape our understanding of the relationship between consciousness and geology. The statement revealed that Chinese scientists, like their Russian counterparts, were detecting aquifer activations and ecosystem restorations across the Eurasian landmass that seemed connected to the African phenomena. Whatever was happening was not limited to Africa. It was a global awakening that could transform human civilization's relationship with the planet itself. As Ibrahim prepared to leave the United Nations building, he paused to look out at the East River, where the lights of 3 continents' diplomatic missions reflected on waters that had witnessed centuries of negotiations that determined the fate of billions of people. But this time felt different. For the first time since the colonial period, Africa was negotiating from a position of strength, offering partnership based on mutual respect rather than accepting charity based on foreign benevolence. The revolution that had begun with water rising from the Sahara was revealing itself to be part of a planetary awakening that could challenge every assumption about resource scarcity, environmental limits, and the possibility of sustainable development. The question was whether human civilization had the wisdom to respond to this gift with cooperation rather than conflict. As his aircraft lifted off from LaGuardia Airport, carrying him back to a continent that was rapidly becoming the center of global transformation, Ibrahim reflected on the irony that the Earth itself seemed to be intervening in human affairs at precisely the moment when such intervention was most needed. The water spirits had not just given Africa independence. They had given the world a chance to choose cooperation over domination, sustainability over exploitation, wisdom over mere power. Whether humanity would prove worthy of such a gift remained to be seen.